Welcome back. So today was the big day and we went live earlier and discussed in brief everything from court. But now that I'm more relaxed and I have my ducks in a row, I wanted to kind of transcribe some parts of the hearing today so that you guys can get a word for word, kind of like a play for play experience from the courtroom. So let's get this party started. So we're going to start right off from where Sarah was cross-examining Brian. He's on the stand and she's interrogating him. She's getting a little personal and the judge has to reel her back multiple times, a multitudinous amount of times, but she made it through the testimony. This particular portion, because we're going to jump around and, play with it a little, have a little fun with it, like the rent money, how Sarah used to do. So this particular part is about time sharing. Sarah wants to explain to the court why she couldn't spend her designated amount of time with little man, and she blames George. Explain to the court why I could not have 100% of my time or 50% of my designated time and the multiple conversations I've had with you about the reason. And Brian's attorney steps in and says, I'm going to object because that's a self-serving statement, hearsay, what she told my client. So the judge agrees and she sustains the objection and tells Sarah, move on, next question. Sarah reiterates, have I ever explained to you the safety, risk, and dangers in my son coming to visit me on days that were mine? And Brian says, not really. I mean, yes, kind of. Most of the times when you had me pick him up at 11 or 12 o'clock at night, it was because you were drinking and you didn't want him there anymore. But you guys would be drinking and just having a good time. And this really made Sarah mad. And he said, and I guess you just didn't want him there anymore. And she said, there was a silence and she said, Brian. And the judge steps in and says, next question, please.
Brian.
Next question, ma'am.
She takes a deep breath and she says, Did little man ever tell you that he likes it at your house more because you have things that I don't have? And Brian's attorney steps in and objects. He says, I'm going to object. That's hearsay. The judge agrees and sustains it, and Sarah moves on to the next question, which is, did you have more than I had? And Brian says, no, not really. I mean, I had a computer, you had a computer. I had a TV, you had a TV. I had space for him to play, you had space for him to play. I had a pool, you had a pool. I mean, my place was bigger, but we had the same things. She glazes right over that and she says, do you understand my criminal case? And Brian chuckles and says, oh yeah. And she says, do you understand the domestic violence portion of my criminal case? And he says, no. Well, yes, but just not from the side you think. And she says, did you see the pictures? And he said, yes, I saw the pictures and the videos. And she just goes past that and says, about the children's rights, I would like to ask, please, where it says number 6, where the children will not hear the parents speak ill of each other. Have you ever called me a murderer or a killer? And Brian says, no. And she says, Brian, you do know you're under oath, right? And he says, yes. There's a difference in calling you a murderer or versus saying that you are being charged for murdering someone. She again says, have you ever called me a murderer in front of our son? And Judge Jackson steps in and says, asked and answered. Move on, Miss Boone. Asked and answered. And Sarah takes a deep breath and she says, have you ever attempted to get contact information for me where I am located? And he's like, what information? And she says, contact information for emergencies. Have you ever tried to contact where I am located for contact information in case of an emergency? And he's like, I would call the prison, I guess, and ask them. And she's like, should there ever be an emergency, have you ever asked me or contacted the prison to find out any contact information on me? And Judge Jackson steps in and says, relevance, Miss Boone, what's the relevance? Well, before she stepped in and said that, Brian was saying, I don't know the steps or the rules. I would just call the prison, I guess. And Judge Jackson stepped in and said, what is the relevance, Miss Boone? What does that have to do with the issues that we are here about today, which is the parenting plan, the alimony, and the lawyer fees? What does this have to do with that? What is the relevance? She seemed to be getting worn down by Sarah Boone at this point. Just starting to get worn down. And then Sarah responds to Judge Jackson and says, well, you see, Your Honor, this is where I don't know exactly what I'm supposed to do. I don't know what it is I'm supposed to be doing right now. So she's just firing off questions at Brian, just random things, just shooting blanks in the air. So she continues with her unclean hands and tells the court how she doesn't know what she's doing. And the judge says, again, I've explained to you a multitudinous amount of times now why we are here and what we are discussing, the parenting plan. And she goes on to explain the three things that we are here today to discuss: the parenting plan, the alimony, and the attorney fees. Then Sarah goes on to say, number 4, and Brian's attorney begins to object, and he says, well, I'll let her finish, and then I'll object. So she says, number 4, how has the relocation improved your economic status and your finances? And he objects for relevance, and the attorney, Judge Jackson, again tells her, stay on track and only ask questions that are relevant to the 3 topics that we discussed. So Judge Jackson is like, ask questions only regarding the topics that I just gave you. We've already stipulated that you've agreed to the relocation to Gainesville, so there's nothing else to ask about that. Only ask right now about the proposed parenting plan. And Sarah says, well, that's what I'm saying. I don't know, because in the proposed parenting plan, it proposes that I have visitations from Friday to Sunday. And how would I do that? And I'm in DOC. And the judge says, I think that's what we're here for, ma'am. We're here to figure that out. Because pretty much, even if Brian offered 5 days a week, it's really up to the Department of Corrections how many visits she can have. It's up to if they're allowing visits, if there's something going on at the prison, if she's allowed visits. And with Brian and Little Man having their own lives and activities to do during the weekends, she wants him to spend the entire weekend coming to visit her, traveling back and forth. Drive there Friday and come and visit, Saturday and come and visit, and Sunday, Sunday fun day. So Sarah jumps over to the parenting plan, the proposed parenting plan, and she says, in the proposed parenting plan, it states that parents are not allowed to use their children as a ploy or mode of communication. How else would you suggest I communicate with you, if not through our son, if you refuse to answer texts, calls, or anything from me? And Brian says, I get all of your tablet messages. I read them all, and if there was something in there that I saw that was worth responding to, I would, but I haven't. So I don't. Brian's been burning Sarah this whole hearing. He's like, I haven't seen anything worth responding to, so I don't. Next question, please, ma'am. Sarah gets a little testy and she says, how would you know if it's a legitimate concern or not if you won't respond? And he says, once again, and she tries to interrupt him, but Judge Jackson says, wait a minute. And he says, once again, you can write the question out on the tablet message and I'll respond. Or if you're on the phone with little man, you can just have him say, hey, mom's gonna call you, blah, blah, blah. And then we can talk. And that's what he literally said, like blah blah blah, and we can talk. And Sarah's like getting a little testy and she says, why can't you just communicate as a parent and an adult? And the judge interjects and says, okay, ma'am, next question. So Sarah says, why was your statement to the court that our son gets upset after our calls? Have you asked him or me what's going on? So this was good. Brian said, he could be upset for any number of reasons. The way you talk to him, what you said to him, any number of reasons of the plethora of emotions you corrupt in him. And she says, is it because you allow him to curse on the phone? And I'm thinking, wow, this man just said, you corrupt a plethora of emotions in this child. That's deep. So she goes on to piggyback on the cursing. Is it because you allow him to curse? And she's pretty much saying like, oh, the reason that little man is upset when they get off of the phone is because she's trying to discipline him for cursing or telling him to watch his language. And she says, is it because you allow him to curse? Let me tell you. And the judge steps in and said, oh no, move on, ma'am. You're not going to tell anybody anything. You're going to ask questions only. So Sarah says, yes, Your Honor. And I imagine her finger in the air. You know how when she was drinking water in the interrogation with Scott, so famous. She says, yes, Your Honor. And then she moves on and says, do you realize the majority of the time he's upset when we get off of the phone is because he wants to visit his mother? It's been over 9 months that he's seen me. So Brian says verbatim, no, and he chuckles. No, not at all. You specifically, the way you talk to him is what upsets him. And after you called him yesterday, he said to me that he would like to have say so over when he talked to you. And Brian must have been telling the truth because she says, she cleared her throat and she said, yes, we talked about that yesterday. And what he told you was, and Brian's attorney steps in and he ejects and he said, we're stepping into hearsay for the minor, hearsay for the child. So Sarah cuts him right off and says, so in regards to telephonic communication with the child, I want to know if you're aware that I know about his girlfriend and his friends at school. And Judge Jackson cuts her off and says, ma'am, we're going to stay on topic to what subjects are at hand. And she went on to explain they are discussing the proposed parenting plan, the opposed alimony, and the attorney's fees. And this is about the 8th time that she has had to redirect Sarah on this matter. So Sarah goes on to make a foolish statement and she says, the sole responsibility of your parental responsibility has not changed since I have been incarcerated. And the judge says, ma'am, what does this have to do with what we're talking about? And she redirects Sarah again for the 9th time. And Sarah says, have I ever bought the minor a gift? And Brian says, with your own money? Yes, have I ever bought the minor child a gift? And Brian begins to question and fumble, and his attorney steps in and says, objection, I'm going to need some context, a time frame to what she's talking about. And The judge tells Sarah, she redirects her and tells her to ask her question again with a time frame. And she says, in the last month, have I bought our son a gift? And Brian said, well, not you, but you had a third party buy him a vinyl record for his vinyl player. Sarah again says, have I bought our son gifts in the past month? And Brian says, you have had a third party buy our son gifts, not you, not your money. You've had a third party purchase our son gifts with their money. And she's like, I'm sorry. And he says, what'd you say? And she says, who is it in my family that I have to help me? And he says, your brother Philip. And she says, why is that? And he says, because your other brother isn't capable? Negative earned. I'm not sure why Sarah thinks that it's Brian's problem that she doesn't have any support, but the judge redirects her again, and she goes right into her son. And she says, why is it harmful for the proposed parenting plan that because she wants to talk to him daily, and she says, why is it harmful that he talks to me so many times? And Brian says, well, because of when he hangs up the phone with you, he's always upset. But she didn't care about that. And she skips right over that and says, do you know my schedule at work where I am located? And he chuckled and said, no, of course I don't. And she said, well, why haven't you asked? And he said, because I don't care. So this is good. She says, did you recently tell our son that he has the authority to speak with me whenever he wants to and how often? And Brian says, no, he told me he would like it to work that way. That's what he wants. And that sounds like what he testified to earlier when he said that after their phone call last week, little man came to him and said, I want to be able to talk to mom when I want to, not when she wants to all the time. So she then steps in and says, why do you not care? And he begins to answer, and it sounds like he was going to say about your about your feelings, but the judge steps in and said, ma'am, next question. We're way off topic. Ma'am, next question, move on. And Sarah says, Your Honor, thank you. Forgive me. She takes a deep breath and she says, have you upheld the active parenting plan since the day of my incarceration? And Brian says, for instance? And his attorney steps in and says, I'm going to object for overbroad. And the Judge Jackson tells her, ma'am, you're going to have to ask another question. Move on. We didn't get closing arguments today, but we did get opening statements. We got testimony. We got evidence. We got exhibits. We got cross-examination. It was great to see. Well, great to hear. And it was great to hear Sarah so frustrated and complaining that she was upset that she wasn't there in person. However, Judge Jackson, when the operations officer came to whisk Sarah away, she said on record that she'd have actually preferred if Sarah was there in person to end this matter. She made it very clear that this was a final hearing, and she would have preferred if Sarah was there so that they can lay it all out on the table. And she had requested that Sarah had transportation, but for some reason it didn't happen. And Sarah even requested, although it was last minute, for transportation as well. And it just seems like, maybe the prison is, overcrowded. It's not that important to them as it is to Sarah. So, they pretty much came and told her, wrap it up. You have 5 minutes. And they literally snatched the phone out of her hand, like mid Well, because Sarah, she didn't want to stop talking, so they had to take the phone from her. I said when the call ended, since Judge Jackson was kind of scolding her, it sounded like Judge Jackson hung up in her face, but I believe that was the jail maybe putting their two fingers on the clicky button and saying bye. So, if you made it this far, I appreciate you, and I will see you on the next episode. Bye.
Not intentionally.
Again,
I would never do that to George.
you did.
Not
It happened.
intentionally. Know that.
I don't.